Writing dialogue, condensed from William Goldman's Adventures in the Screen Trade, Robert McKee's story, and a lecture by Dean Batali. One of the things I learned during my years working on JAG is that dialogue is just stuff. Steven Zito, the head writer, uh, I worked for seasons 3 and 4, and he was back 2 more times during the show's 10-year run as head writer. Don't get bogged down in dialogue. It's the easiest thing to change even years after a film's been shot. Thank you, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. If you can't think of the exact turn of phrase, leave a placeholder. Most important, dialogue is not conversation. Do not write how you or anyone else speaks. It's got to. Dialogue is not like normal speech. It's got to be better than normal speech. Think Aaron Sorkin or Amy Sherman Palladino. You may not be fans of their writing, but they've got a, an ear for the rhythm of dialogue by extremely clever and often fast talking people. Also, avoid overly expository information. Soap operas do that a lot. Why? Because soap operas, even though there are only a few left these days, back when every network had multiple soap operas, they didn't count on every audience member watching every single episode. So you would often build recaps into the dialogue of what's happened previously. One of my favorite comedies is Soap Dish, starring Sally Field, Whoopi Goldberg, Kevin Kline, Elizabeth Shue, Robert Downey Jr., Kathy Moriarty. 6 actors just having a blast doing this insane movie about behind the scenes at a soap opera where the soap actors' real lives are even crazier than their characters' lives. Check it out. I highly guarantee you'll be amused. 3 rules of screen dialogue. Number 1, compression and economy. Number 2, direction, as in there's got to be some kind of forward momentum. And 3, purpose. There's got to be a reason for it. Good screen dialogue should be made of short, simply constructed sentences. Generally a movement from a noun to a verb to an object, or a movement from noun to a verb to a complement in that order. The key is that before DVRs and still in movie theaters, audience members need to understand what the characters on screen are saying. This was before the advent of what I call mumble vision, where a lot of American actors mumble their lines. I can't tell you how many times I've had to watch TV either with the DVR, rewinding it to find out what the actors say, or sometimes even putting on the closed captioning. It's that bad these days, but that's not how it's supposed to be. There's a great word that the Greeks use, sticomythia, pardon my pronunciation, the rapid exchange of short speeches. Long speeches are antithetical with film aesthetics. Remember, film is really good at presenting sights and sounds and movement. Theater is great for long speeches. If you can't resist monologuing, thank you, Brad Bird and The Incredibles, for giving us that term. Break your speeches into action-reaction patterns that shape the speaker's behavior. Think of Salieri in the film version of Amadeus. He's giving a confession to a priest, and it's also a case of an unreliable narrator because the priest comes to learn that Salieri is crazy. Never write a line of dialogue when you can create a visual expression. And some of the easiest ways to do this are, instead of have somebody say yes, have them nod. Instead of having them say no, have them shake their head. Instead of them saying, I don't know, have them shrug. Voiceover. Not a big fan. Just too many times people use voiceover as a crutch, as a narrative crutch to handle exposition because they're not doing a good job telling the story visually. The rule of thumb is if you can remove voiceover and the story still makes sense and it's well told, leave it in. Otherwise, cut it. Blade Runner, the theatrical release and the home video release, both have voiceover. I'm not a fan of voiceover in Blade Runner, but you can argue to keep it in because if you're looking at the movie as kind of a neo-noir with Rick Deckard as, kind of a successor of the detectives played by Humphrey Bogart and others in the classic film noir era, it works. But I prefer the 92 director's cut with no voiceover. By the way, one of the great uses of voiceover is counterpoint narration. Woody Allen is king of that. If you haven't seen Annie Hall, you need to. And another example is Juno, more recently by Diablo Cody. Good dialogue must be organic, should reveal character, and each character should have a distinct voice from the other characters. Defines relationships, you should be able to infer the relationship based on the dialogue. Creates suspense, and may contain humor. There's a great scene from a lost episode called Outlaws from season 1 where Sawyer and Kate play a quote-unquote friendly game of I Never, which takes a turn when the game starts getting more personal. But it's a great little scene because they're playing this friendly game and they seem to have a connection, and then she transgresses by saying something kind of personal and he hits back. It's a great little scene. Dialogue problems. OTN, on the nose, which means it lacks subtext. Goldman says, if the scene is about what the scene is about, you're in deep doo-doo, I paraphrase. Stilted dialogue, that means no contractions, it's not colloquial, it doesn't sound like real people talking. Flat and lifeless because the characters all sound alike. Overly expository. Remember the primary rule of cinema, show don't tell. An overwritten dialogue, less is more. I tell this to my students every year when I teach basic screenwriting, and I've never, in going on 20 years of teaching, I've never told students, any student, this dialogue was just too short, I need more. I'm usually cutting it down, paring it down to the bare essentials, because that works. It applies to that Greek word, stigmathia, I talked about before. Text versus subtext. Subtext is a hard issue for some people to grapple with. The key concept is what is left unsaid is often more compelling than that which is spoken. Think about the movie Sideways. There's a great scene between Paul Giamatti and Virginia Madsen when she asks him why he likes Pinot so much, and he just talks about Pinot. This long descriptive little speech, but he's talking about himself. And her response, he asks her what got her into wine, and she talks about her ex-husband because he had this big showy wine cellar, and then she discovered he was a fraud. But the subtext of his speech is love me, and the subtext of her speech is let me love you. And by the end, she's got her hand physically on his, and he freaks out and literally asks where the bathroom is. It's a great little scene.